Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to mini episode 350 of Real Life Ghost Stories, and I have 4 spooky stories for you today, and the last story comes from March the 27th, 2024. And story number 1 comes from Sadie. When my grandma was around 16, her and her family lived in a barn house, and it was covered in spirits and ghosts. One night my grandma's family left for the night, so she was home alone with no one around. My grandma was sitting on her bed when she heard jiggling from her shoes. She turned around and saw them moving for a split second, and then they stopped. My grandma was shocked and stuck in place. Another night my grandma was home alone again. She was a bit older and had just moved into a new house that was also a farmhouse close to her old one. My grandma was alone and was chilling, but then wanted to make something clear. Usually a lot of things happened at her house and they were always harmless, but they scared her. So one night she yelled as loud as she could, "I don't know if you're here or not, but could you please leave me alone tonight? I will get scared and I don't want that." Or something like that, but nothing happened that night. My mother did the same thing years later and it worked as well. So anyone who's afraid, just ask them to stop. Sadie, that seems to be very good advice, very sage advice. And it seems to have worked numerous times in various stories that we have read over the years from listeners, that there comes a point where they go, "No, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm tired. I just want to have a nice night in without being freaked out. So I'm going to say, no, you're going to leave me alone. You're not going to freak me out. I don't mind you being here, but just leave me out of your business." And it seems to work for people. I would also be freaked if a ghost tried to steal my shoes. I wouldn't be very happy about that. And story number 2 comes from Leo. Back in March 2020, my preschool centre shut down because of COVID. For a while, we didn't know if things would reopen, so one of the families from the centre asked me to nanny. Weeks turned into months, and I ended up working with them for a whole year. The children I nannied were 3 and 1. We will call them Big and Little. I had known Big since they were 4 months old and started to nanny for them around the time that Little was the same age. I loved every moment of being with the two of them. With that said, this is a ghost story podcast, so of course my time with them involved some pretty creepy shit. For more background on me to help explain how I stayed so calm through all this, I was an infant teacher for 4 years and a preschool teacher for 2 years before these events. That, and as I've shared in other episodes, I am a medium. Yay me! So I was already well acquainted with black shadows and roaming spirits at that time. Now before COVID, I had come over here and there to watch Big. The family lived in a beautiful neighbourhood and had a huge backyard and garden. Their house was on the older side, and their decor style is mostly colonial. It gives this older vibe that makes you feel like you are being watched most of the time. The large windows facing this huge backyard, complete with 100-year-old apple trees, did not help the vibe. The first night I immediately felt the presence of 2 spirits. One was a large shadow figure that didn't seem comfortable with me. The other is a woman with long brown hair and an old-fashioned dress. I believe she was either the house spirit or a relative of the family. She always peeked around corners from afar, and seemed to be just checking in on Big to make sure that he was safe. I was so used to seeing stuff at this point that I said hello to the woman and ignored the shadow. On that first night after Big was asleep, I stayed in his room with him until the parents got home. I'm not sure how Big was supposed to save me from ghosts, but after sitting in the sunroom and either staring into the dark yard or this long-ass hallway filled with old furniture, I decided I was not going to be alone for a second longer. The only other creepy thing that I noticed that night was a stain on the handle of the downstairs sink. It looked like an angry woman, I kid you not. Every time I used the bathroom, I felt like it was watching me. It made me feel so uncomfortable, and I booked it out of the bathroom as soon as I was done. It was definitely just a water stain or something, but still super creepy. Things started getting weirder after I worked at their house full time. The house spirit was around often at the start, but later faded. I think she got used to me and trusted me to look after the children on my own. The shadow was around more and more. After a few months, I swear there were more shadows. I saw them almost daily out of the corner of my eye, sometimes multiple times a day. They often hung out in the kitchen by the basement door or in Big's room. I had also seen them once or twice in the parents' bedroom while rocking Little to sleep. Dad worked from home all week and Mom worked from home 2 days a week. One day I was in the hallway upstairs holding Little and the baby monitor. Big was in their room asleep, and the parents and I were talking about the kids. Then we all heard a creepy little giggle on the monitor. I suggested that it was Big in their sleep, and Mom said it must have been picked up from another house. It was creepy as hell though. Over the winter I spent the night any time a bad storm blew in. I've grown up in New England my whole life, but I am still scared to drive in too much snow. The second time I spent the night, we got about 24 inches of snow, so sleeping over was definitely worth it. The family had 2 guest rooms which doubled as each parent's office. I picked the room next to Big's room, and Big didn't wake up every couple of hours crying, so I thought I'd get more sleep. I was so uncomfortable being alone in that room though, so I stayed up late watching TikToks. The main thing that kept me up that night, however, was a thing that leaned over my bed. The room had 2 old-fashioned beds, and I picked the bed right next to the door. The door was to my left, and then there were 2 bedside tables to my right, followed by the second bed, which was against the wall. I kept feeling like something was under the second bed, so I laid facing that direction. The house was eerily quiet because of the snow. If you've ever experienced a massive snowstorm in the country, you know what kind of silence I am talking about. All through the night, I would wake up in this silence, and about the 3rd time I woke up, I saw it standing over me. It had white fur and a long neck. Picture a Kaminoan from Star Wars, but with a more ape-like face, and with thick, short fur and light brown ears that stuck out from the sides of its head. It had big, round, light eyes, and it seemed kind and curious. It had little hands that were clasped together by its middle, and it was leaning all the way over the middle of the bed. While it seemed kind, I was terrified. Looking back, I want to believe seeing it was actually just a dream, because I cannot wrap my head around what that thing was otherwise. Maybe Bigfoot didn't like the storm and wanted to sleep in the second bed. By far the most unsettling part of this job, however, was the basement. During the winter and early spring, we spent a ton of time down there. It was a 3rd finished. We would walk down these steep steps, and on the right was an open space with hard concrete flooring. This side had the boiler, washer and dryer and some shelving. On the left was a doorway leading into what Big called the dark room. This is a small room with a dark purple rug, concrete walls and more shelving. To turn on the light, you had to walk in the middle and pull a string. This area even had a creepy closet under the stairs with no door. The walls of the closet were painted bright red, and the floor was covered by lamps with no lampshades. This was where I saw one of the shadows a lot. Most of the time, I used the light from the other side of the stairs to see, and just ran through this part to get to the playroom. At the end of the dark room, we'd open what looked like an outside door, which led to the finished part of the basement. The door was thick and had a window at the top, just like the door to someone's house. This door also didn't close all of the way, allowing us to see into the dark room and further out to the stairs. This last room was much more inviting, with normal off-white walls, regular lighting and white rug flooring. While it was the playroom, it was also used for storage, so it had a bunch of clothing and baby items. It also had a playmat, a play tent, a slide and a little balance beam. The room itself always felt inviting and fun. However, often when we played, I could see a black shadow looking in through the windows in the door. I noticed the figure in the dark room early on and just ignored it. But as it started coming to the door, I noticed a shift in its intentions. It went from feeling curious to mad. It didn't seem to like us coming down there, and I got the sense that it did not like me. One day, while the children were sleeping, I went down on my own and loudly told it to leave us alone and to stay in the closet when we needed to walk through the dark room. After that day, I would sometimes see it move to the closet as we left the playroom, but then it would sometimes move to the bottom of the stairs as we went up. I always tried to stay calm to not scare Big, but let me tell you, remaining calm while Big slowly climbed the steps while I was stuck behind him holding Little was horrific. The worst part of that thing was when the kids interacted or talked about it. Big started talking about it when Little first began crawling. He would look at the door a lot, and when I asked what he was looking at, he would say, "Little's friend." Soon after that, Big would randomly say, "Little wants to play with her friend." Big would say this on some days as we were playing upstairs. To be honest, each time he said it, I just ignored him, and we stayed upstairs for the rest of the day. Then, when Little was old enough to talk and say a few words, she loved to say hello to anyone who would look at her. So, naturally, she sometimes went right to the playroom door and said hello and waved into the dark room. The worst part was that she would repeat hello until the person she was talking to said it back. So she would just stand there saying hello until I got too uncomfortable and scooped her away from the door. My final experience at this house was perhaps the most terrifying. The kids and I were home alone, while Mom and Dad went to the hospital. Mom had gotten hurt that morning and they needed to rush off. The doctor took great care of her, and she was home later that day, but it was a stressful day nonetheless. We were in the kitchen playing with Play-Doh when I heard a massive crash upstairs. I asked Big to put their words away for a moment, and they yelled, "I've something to say." I was scared someone was in the house, so I told them to be quiet, this time with my teacher's voice. There were 2 baby gates blocking off the hallway to the stairs, so I dialed 911 on my phone and grabbed a proper knife before leaving the children and heading upstairs, knowing I would hear if anyone tried to open a gate to get to them. At this point, Big had gone back to playing, rightfully mad at me for ignoring them. Little was in a playpen next to Big, so I left them to play while I checked on everything in the house. I walked around upstairs checking every nook and cranny with my finger hovering over the call button and my knife ready to go. No one was there. Nothing had fallen. After checking everything over a second time, I did a quick check downstairs and made sure to latch the deadbolt on the basement door. An hour or so later, Dad came back and I told him what had happened. He also did a check around the house and told me it must have been his guitar case. He explained that it's unsteady and super loud when it falls. He ate his lunch quickly and headed back to the hospital. The only problem was that I had checked his office while I was upstairs, and I remembered the guitar case being in its usual place, still upright and leaning up against the wall. I would love to know if the parents had experienced anything, like if they were seeing little bits and pieces around the house or even having those feelings around the house. I would love to know. Clearly the kids were seeing something. Clearly they were experiencing something. They Didn't seem to be afraid of it though, which kind of feels like a good thing. But then, you know, kids are creepy. Kids are weird little things. And even if, like, that little giggle on the monitor that you and the mum and dad heard, even if that is the kid laughing in their sleep or it's something else picked up on the monitor, there is something inherently terrifying about hearing a child's laugh in a place where there's not supposed to be child's laughter. And in regards to the thing that was leaning over your bed while you slept and you woke up and there was a creature with white fur and a long neck leaning over your bed, I had to Google what a Kaminoan from Star Wars is, or I don't know how you pronounce it. I think they're from the Kamino system is where they're from. And if you like Star Wars, like I like Star Wars a lot, but I'm not like an expert on Star Wars knowledge. They're the alien dudes with the long necks who make the clone army. That's who they are. Obi-Wan goes to visit them in one of the episodes. Anyway, that's who was leaning over the bed. So I would like to think that was a dream, because I don't want to think about those being real. I don't want to think about those being real creatures, even if they are covered in fur and seem kind and curious. I don't want to know. I don't want that to be a thing. And that basement room just sounds terrifying. Like, that room in the basement sounds scary, and all of the shadow figure action sounds incredibly scary. I wonder what it was that made the shadow figure turn from like curious to really angry. Like, I'd love to know what the event was, or what the moment was, or what the thing it was seeing was that made it feel angry. Was it like a space thing? Was it you and the kids being in its space? But it does seem like you saying, hey, I need you to stay in the closet, kind of worked. What an utterly terrifying story.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
And story number 3 comes from Kate. I don't know if this would count as one of your ghost stories, but it was definitely weird. I was a nurse working on a medical floor, and the doors to the ICU were down the hallway. I had stopped in the room we laughingly called a kitchen to get a pudding for a patient. One of the aides, Katie, who I worked with, was standing outside. I joined her for a brief chat before returning to my patient. Now, we were both looking towards the ICU door. All of a sudden, we both saw what I can only describe as a cellophane-like being coming out through the closed door. Katie was looking in that direction and had this quizzical look on her face. I was just about to ask her if she saw what I thought I saw when over the loudspeaker a code was announced. This is when someone goes into cardiac arrest and the team is called to resuscitate. Well, at that point, we both knew that patient was not going to be successfully resuscitated. The cellophane soul actually took a turn from the door and floated down the stairs, which was located just around the corner from the ICU door. I took a big gulp and asked Katie if she saw anything weird. Her answer was, and I'm getting the hell out of here, which confirmed my suspicions. By the way, we always left a window open, even just the slightest, if we knew a patient was dying. Guess the window was closed. This happened in the early 1970s. This idea of leaving the windows open to allow people's soul to leave their body, it seems almost, folkloric. Like, people talk about it like it's an old wives' tale, but the amount of nurses that have written into this podcast that who do that, who leave the windows open for people's souls to leave their bodies, as well as numerous families that I know who have done the same thing and who would do the same thing, and that it's a very important ritual for families and for people to do when somebody's dying. It is absolutely incredible that you both saw this sort of cellophane-like being come through the closed door. Like, I wonder, was that the person's soul, their spirit, their essence leaving their body? And the more I hear these stories from nurses, the more I'm convinced that something happens when you die. Do you know, whatever that is, wherever you go, that I don't know the answer to, but something seems to happen when you die. And story number 4 comes from William. I was born, raised, and still reside in the Appalachians of the eastern United States. My maternal grandfather purchased a 2-room house with 45 acres in the early 40s. He raised my mom and her 5 siblings there, all the while building on to make it a very nice 2-story farmhouse. My mom was left this house with 2 acres and we moved in when I was 12 years old. My room was upstairs, and it was a large room that was built over the living room. It was about 14 feet wide by 25 feet long. The ceiling was only 6.5 feet tall and about 8 feet wide to where there were slants in the ceiling that matched the roof. When you walked into my room, there was a window immediately to the left, which created an alcove in the ceiling, so you had to duck when coming in. About 10 feet down from there was another alcove with 2 windows. In that alcove, I had an old couch that was a pull-out bed. A very small single bed. When you walked into my room, to the right was where my bed was. In between the 2 windows, I had a chest of drawers with a radio clock that had digital green lighting. So when I was lying in the bed on my left side, I was facing the wall that had the windows and my digital clock. Backing up a bit, my paternal grandmother passed away from cancer when she was in her mid-70s, and this was in 1985. She and my pop had retired in Maryland, and we visited them multiple times a year, especially around the holidays. My grandfather was in his late 80s at the time. He was still able to live on his own, though my cousin stayed there to help out when needed. Fast forward a few years, my cousin had a boyfriend, and they wished to move forward with their lives together, so the decision was made for my grandfather to come and live with us. He wasn't real happy about it, but I loved having him around, as we created a closer bond. I loved hearing the stories he told, being a World War I veteran and retired shipyard manager. I was about 17 at the time. My friends loved him, and hearing the stories as well. He enjoyed the attention and having us around. One day he started telling my dad and I that his wife had come to see him, and she was ready for him to come to her. He said he missed her, and he was going to go to her. We were, of course, being supportive, so we were saying, "Sure, Pop, you'll see Granny again one day." For several days he would say it. "I saw your Granny, and I am going to see her soon." He was smiling, and just as happy as he could be. It was only a couple of days later, while sitting in his favourite chair taking a nap, that he passed away. I can't think of a more peaceful and fitting end for a man living 96 years on this earth. Of course, we were very sad, but a man to live a life like that, and that long, just wow. A few months later, a buddy of mine and I had been working on our job all day. We went out, got some dinner, and just hung out that evening. We had a very early day the next day, so at around 11 we went upstairs to go to bed. I was in my bed, and he was on the pull-out couch between the windows. It wasn't long after I heard my sister and her friends coming in. They were being loud, as most teenagers are. It was then that I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I was tired, and having an early day, I wasn't going to get up. I just pretended I was asleep, and my friend did the same. My door opened and I saw someone come in, thinking it was my sister or one of her friends, seeing if we were awake. They walked right by my bed, over to the pull-out bed, leaned over, reached out and touched my friend's leg. Then stood up, turned around, walked out, closed the door and started down the steps. I knew every step when someone was walking on them, and the footsteps didn't start until about 3/4 of the way up. When the person walked by my bed, they were between me and my digital clock, but the clock never blinked out. When the figure passed my clock, I could continuously see the clock, and the same happened when they returned to go out of the room. And when they went down the stairs, they only took about 3 steps, then went quiet. There were 16 steps. I was tired and at the time didn't think much about it. My friend asked, "Who was that?" I said I wasn't sure. I think it may have been my sister or one of her friends. He said I thought so too, but I didn't see a person, I only saw a figure. I said that I didn't either, but it's a dark room, and we chalked it up again to just being tired and thinking that we saw things. I asked my sister the next morning if she or any of her friends had come into my room, and she told me no, they had gotten some snacks and went to her room. The older I got, the more I thought about that situation. Was it my grandfather dropping in to let me know that he was okay and with my granny? I'd like to think so. One last thing about that. When he lived with us, my bed was actually where the pull-out couch was. I had only gotten that couch and rearranged things after he had passed away. My father-in-law was 15 years older than my mother-in-law. He had met her while on deployment, married and brought her back to the States. When he retired from the military, he was given some land by the folks that raised him. He built a house and had 2 kids, my wife and brother-in-law. My brother-in-law was 10 years older than my wife, and my father-in-law was 45 when she was born. She was raised in that house. We met and started dating when her dad was about 61. He retired at 63. He had later given us some of his land and we put a house up there. My wife was really close to her dad, and I'd gotten really close to him as well, especially living next door. I'd join him many early mornings for coffee at his old kitchen table. He was diagnosed with cancer in late January 2005. He was 71 at the time and was so eaten up with the disease that any type of treatment would only prolong his life by a few months. He made the decision not to do treatments. When he got to the point where he was bedridden, my wife could no longer stand to see him that way without breaking down. Hospice was called in, and her brother and I would take in turns staying with her mom to help look after him. One night, while I was with him, the hospice came in and took his vitals, and everything was very low. She said she didn't think he would make it through the night. It was only an hour later, while my mother-in-law and I were sitting at his side, that he took his last breath. Fast forward 3 years. My mother-in-law did not want to live that far up in the mountains by herself anymore. She wanted to sell the house. So my wife and I decided to buy our home place from her mother to raise our family in. It was a brick ranch that's originally had a carport my father-in-law had turned into a den. My chair sat in the back corner of the den, which faces a doorway into what was the formal living room. In the far corner of that living room was a curio cabinet for knickknacks and such. It was beside a doorway leading to the kitchen. It was lined with a mirror in the back. From my chair, in that mirror, you could see into the kitchen. Not long after being there, when I would be sitting in my chair, I would catch things out of the corner of my eye in that mirror while no one was in the kitchen. I chalked it up to just seeing things, or something glaring off one of the knickknacks that were in there. One evening, when I was watching some TV, I saw something walk in the kitchen because it completely blocked out the light, and I saw it through the mirror. I yelled at my wife, "Are you in the kitchen?" And I heard her yell, "No," back at me from the back of the house. I laughed and said, "What did you do, run to the back?" She didn't know what I was talking about. She had been in the back of the house the whole time. I asked her if she wasn't just in the kitchen, and she said no, that she had been back there folding clothes. My kids were outside playing, so it wasn't them. Again, I shook it off as seeing things. But nearly every night when I was sitting in that chair by myself, when everyone else was gone or in bed, I would always see something out of the corner of my eye, block the light in the kitchen that reflected into that mirror. My father-in-law was a very early riser and loved having his coffee in the kitchen. I'm convinced it was him continuing to enjoy his kitchen and quiet time. I started saying hi to him every time this happened. that I was taking care of his wife, his daughter, his grandkids, and for him to rest well. We've since sold the home place, built our own, and are beginning to make new memories. I'm sure he's still shuffling down the hall and enjoying his morning coffee at the old table in the kitchen. These are two very beautiful stories. Terrifying, of course, but beautiful stories nonetheless. You often hear stories of people who say that their loved ones have come back to collect them just before they die, and I think that's a really incredibly beautiful thing to think about. I think it's lovely to think that your granddad didn't face death on his own, that his wife, who he loved, came back to tell him that she was going to come and get him and they were going to be together, which is, I mean, that's all any of us could hope for, really, if we're on the way out. And maybe he was just coming back to check on you. It really does sound like he was, particularly because, as you said, your room layout was different when he was alive to after he had passed away. So it makes sense that his spirit would have gone to your friend in the sofa bed rather than going to you. I always enjoy it too when somebody else witnesses the same thing that you do, so you can be like, okay, this definitely happened. Whatever it was, it definitely happened. And in regards to the second part of your story, it definitely sounds like your father-in-law is coming back to enjoy that time, that quiet time in his kitchen, because that was his home. And now, obviously it was inhabited by his daughter and his grandkids and his son-in-law. And of course he was going to come back and check and make sure that everybody was okay. Two really lovely stories to round out the episode. Thank you to Sadie, Leo, Kate and William for sending in your stories. Remember, if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.